"You damned maid," Richard Hale shouted as Nina stumbled, spilling a glass of red wine onto his expensive suit. Nina lowered the tray, her training guiding her movements even as her heart began to pound. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said quickly, reaching for a clean white linen cloth from the tray. "Let me help." "Watch what you're doing," Hale snapped, staring down at the spreading stain in disbelief. His face tightened with irritation sharpened into fury. "Yes, sir," Nina replied calmly. She stepped closer, carefully dabbing the fabric, applying light pressure to prevent the wine from setting deeper into the wool. She focused on the task, hoping efficiency might calm the situation. Before she could finish a second motion, Hale grabbed her wrist. Pain shot instantly through her arm. "I said, fix it," he barked, tightening his grip as if punishment alone could reverse the damage. Nina gasped quietly, her fingers instinctively tightening around the cloth as the pressure increased. "I'm trying, sir," she said, her voice controlled despite the pain. His fingers dug deeper into her skin, forcing her to shift her weight to keep balance. "Do you even understand what this suit costs?" Hale demanded loudly, making sure the nearby guests could hear. "I'm very sorry," Nina repeated. "Sorry?" he scoffed, tightening his grip again. "Your entire year's salary wouldn't cover this jacket." Several guests nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. Hale leaned closer, lowering his voice into something colder. "Can you even see properly?" he sneered. "Or does your skin color block the light?" The insult struck harder than the physical pain. Nina felt heat rise in her chest but forced her breathing to remain steady. She did not pull away violently. She did not argue. Years of working invisible jobs had taught her something important. Losing composure often cost more than keeping it. "It was an accident," she said quietly. "You people are always accidents," Hale replied sharply. His grip tightened once more, forcing a small cry from Nina before she could stop herself. "Let go," someone whispered faintly from the edge of the gathering, though the voice carried no authority. Hale ignored it. "You should consider yourself fortunate this is a charity event," he continued loudly. "Otherwise I would demand immediate compensation." He glanced down at the stain again with visible disgust. "No one saves people like you," he said, his tone cruel and deliberate. "You exist to serve. That is your place." Nina's wrist throbbed under his fingers. Still, she did not beg. She did not protest. Dignity was sometimes the only possession no one could take. "I understand this was inconvenient," she replied carefully. "Inconvenient?" Hale laughed bitterly. "This suit costs more than you earn in a year. Even if you worked every day, you could never repay this mistake." He released her wrist with a dismissive shove. Nina steadied herself, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted the cloth between her fingers. Around them, the music continued, but softer now, strained under tension. A few guests looked away. Others pretended interest in their phones. Power often revealed itself in silence. Hale adjusted his cuff, still visibly angry. "No one's going to save you," he repeated coldly. "Understand that." Nina lowered her gaze respectfully. "I apologize for the accident," she said once more. Hale exhaled sharply, clearly unsatisfied by her calmness. "You should be grateful. I allow you to remain employed," he muttered. He stepped forward again, invading her space, raising his voice just enough to humiliate but not enough to appear completely out of control. "You should learn to look up when important people walk past you." Before Nina could respond, another voice entered the moment. "That's enough." Nina turned slightly as a tall man stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, Adrian Volkov. Volkov's gaze moved briefly to Nina's wrist, still faintly red from the pressure of Hale's grip. Then he looked directly at Hale. "Release the employee," Volkov said calmly. Hale's jaw tightened. "This does not concern you," Hale replied stiffly. Volkov did not blink. "It concerns me when professionalism is mistaken for permission," he said evenly. The room remained silent. Volkov stepped closer, removing a folded white linen handkerchief from his breast pocket and offering it to Nina without breaking eye contact with Hale. "No one deserves to be handled like property," he continued. Nina accepted the handkerchief carefully, surprised by the simple gesture. Hale scoffed quietly, attempting to recover his composure. "It was an accident," Volkov added, "and accidents do not justify disrespect." For the first time since the spill, Hale hesitated. Volkov's presence changed the mathematics of the moment. The murmur of the ballroom did not immediately return after Adrian Volkov spoke. Instead, a subtle hesitation lingered in the air, as if the room itself needed a moment to adjust to the shift in gravity. Richard Hale straightened his cuff slowly, his irritation now tempered by calculation. He understood power when he saw it, and Volkov was not a man easily dismissed. "This was merely an unfortunate incident," Hale said finally, forcing composure back into his voice. "Surely we can agree accidents happen." Volkov did not respond immediately. His attention moved briefly toward Nina again, observing the faint mark around her wrist where pressure had been applied moments earlier. His expression revealed nothing, yet the stillness in his posture suggested careful assessment rather than indifference. "Accidents do happen," Volkov said at last. "Character, however, is revealed by how one responds to them." The sentence was calm, almost conversational, yet it landed with unmistakable weight. Several guests nodded quietly, relieved that the tension appeared to be dissolving without escalation. Hale gave a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "I trust the event staff will ensure higher standards moving forward." "The staff performed their duties appropriately," Volkov replied evenly. A flicker of discomfort crossed Hale's face, though he quickly masked it with a practiced expression of professional courtesy. "Well," Hale said, adjusting the cuff of his stained sleeve, "I would hate for such a minor inconvenience to distract from such an important evening." Volkov inclined his head slightly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. The exchange ended not with resolution, but with quiet understanding. The matter would go no further tonight. Hale turned toward the bar, requesting sparkling water and discreetly contacting his assistant regarding wardrobe arrangements. Within minutes, a staff coordinator guided him toward a private lounge to address the damage to his suit. The crowd slowly resumed its rhythm. Music regained its natural volume. Conversations restarted, though softer than before. Moments like this tended to linger in memory long after they ended. Nina stood still for a moment, steadying her breathing. The handkerchief, Volkov, had given her felt heavier than its fabric suggested. She carefully folded it once, unsure whether she was expected to return it immediately or later. "You may take a moment," Volkov said quietly, his voice lowered enough that only she could hear. "Thank you, sir," Nina replied, maintaining respectful composure. His gaze rested on her briefly, observant but not intrusive. "You handled yourself professionally," he added. Nina nodded once. "I appreciate the opportunity to correct my mistake." Volkov's expression remained neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he disagreed with her assessment. "It was not your mistake alone," he said calmly. "Crowded rooms create shared responsibility." He paused slightly, then added, "Continue your work." "Yes, sir." Nina inclined her head and returned to the service station, her movements precise though her thoughts moved faster than usual. She rinsed her hands briefly under cool water in the service corridor, allowing the sensation to calm the lingering pulse in her wrist. One of the senior servers, Margaret, approached quietly. "You all right?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," Nina replied. Margaret studied her expression for a moment, then gave a small nod of understanding. "Some people measure worth by price tags," Margaret said quietly. "Others measure it by behavior." Nina allowed a faint, polite smile. "I try not to measure at all," she answered. Margaret's lips curved slightly in approval before she returned to her station. Nina resumed service, circulating between tables with controlled confidence. She balanced trays carefully, ensuring each guest received quiet, attentive care. Experience had taught her that professionalism restored equilibrium even when emotions threatened to disrupt it. Across the room, she noticed Richard Hale re-emerge wearing a dark navy jacket provided by the event coordinator. The substitute garment fit reasonably well, though not perfectly tailored. His expression remained guarded as he resumed conversation with potential investors. Volkov stood nearby speaking with an older couple, his tone calm, his gestures minimal. He listened more than he spoke, a characteristic Nina had observed before within the estate. Powerful individuals often revealed themselves not by how much they spoke, but by how much attention they commanded without effort. As the evening progressed, The charity's director approached the podium to welcome attendees. The speech focused on healthcare initiatives, community investment, and long-term infrastructure support. Many guests listened attentively, individuals who had reached a stage in life where legacy often mattered more than acquisition. Nina moved between tables, refilling water glasses, adjusting place settings, ensuring quiet efficiency. At one table, a retired judge spoke softly to his companions. "The difficulty with influence," he said thoughtfully, "is remembering that authority is not the same as virtue." His words resonated with several listeners. Another guest, a woman in her early 60s, responded gently, "Respect must be practiced consistently, especially when no one is watching." Nina did not react outwardly, but the conversation settled into her thoughts. By 9:30, dinner service concluded smoothly. Dessert plates circulated. Coffee was poured. The atmosphere gradually relaxed into polite satisfaction. Professional success often depended on the absence of disruption. Tonight had nearly provided one. As Nina returned empty glasses to the service station, she noticed Volkov standing near the balcony doors overlooking the city skyline. The soft reflection of lights shimmered across the glass behind him. He did not appear distracted. He appeared observant. As though reviewing more than the evening itself, Nina focused on her responsibilities, yet she sensed the lingering echo of earlier tension had not fully disappeared. Moments of humiliation sometimes created unexpected openings, not because they were deserved, but because they revealed truths normally hidden beneath social performance. Near the end of her shift, the event coordinator approached her. "Mr. Volkov requested the name of the server involved earlier," the coordinator said carefully. "For commendation purposes." Nina hesitated briefly. "My name is Nina Brooks," she replied. The coordinator nodded, making note on a tablet. "You maintain professionalism under pressure," she said quietly. "That does not go unnoticed." Nina inclined her head politely. Recognition was not something she expected, but acknowledgement carried its own quiet weight. As guests began collecting coats and concluding conversations, Nina completed her final duties with consistent precision. She replaced folded linens, ensured glassware returned safely to trays, and thanked kitchen staff before retrieving her bag. Outside, the Manhattan air felt cooler. City lights stretched endlessly across the skyline. She exhaled slowly, releasing tension she had not fully acknowledged during the shift. Her wrist still ached faintly. Her thoughts remained steady. Dignity did not require defense through argument. Sometimes it revealed itself simply through endurance. If this moment resonated with you, tell us where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. Your voice matters, and your perspective helps this community grow stronger. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support allows more stories about dignity, justice, and quiet courage to reach those who need them most. Behind her, inside the ballroom, Adrian Volkov concluded a brief conversation and watched discreetly as Nina exited through the service corridor. He did not call her back. He did not create a scene. He simply observed. Because occasionally, the most valuable qualities revealed themselves quietly, and those who recognized value early rarely forgot where they first saw it. The night air outside the ballroom carried the faint scent of rain on warm pavement, the kind that lingered long after the storm had passed. Nina Brooks walked toward the employee exit with measured steps, her black flats quiet against the polished corridor floor. The tension from earlier still rested in her shoulders, not heavy enough to slow her, but present enough to remind her that moments of humiliation rarely disappeared completely. They settled somewhere deeper, transforming slowly into something else resolve, perhaps. She retrieved her small canvas bag from the staff locker room, carefully placing Adrian Volkov's folded white handkerchief inside a separate pocket so it would not wrinkle. The fabric was heavier than expected, finely woven, understated yet unmistakably expensive. She intended to return it at the next opportunity. Borrowed items, her mother used to say, should never remain borrowed longer than necessary. Most of the catering staff spoke quietly while finishing their duties. Some replayed the earlier confrontation in hushed voices, not with cruelty but with the cautious curiosity that follows public tension. Nina avoided engaging in speculation. She preferred silence over dramatization. "You handled that better than most would," Margaret said gently as she removed her serving gloves. Some people spend a lifetime believing kindness is weakness. Nina gave a small nod. Anger rarely solves practical problems. Margaret smiled faintly. You sound older than 29. Experience tends to age people unevenly. Nina replied softly. Margaret studied her for a moment before adding, There are people in that room who noticed more than you think. Nina did not ask who. She already suspected. Outside, the Manhattan skyline shimmered in reflections across dark glass towers. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, horns distant but familiar. The city did not pause for anyone's discomfort. It continued forward, indifferent and constant. Nina checked the bus schedule on her phone, 43 minutes until the next route toward Queens. She decided to walk 2 blocks to a quieter stop where the crowds thinned and the streetlights flickered more softly against the pavement. Her wrist still felt tender where Richard Hale's grip had tightened earlier. The faint impression of his fingers had already begun fading, yet the memory remained sharper than the physical mark. Physical pain, she had learned, healed faster than wounded dignity. She replayed the moment in her mind, not to dwell on humiliation but to understand it. People often revealed their insecurities most clearly when confronted with inconvenience. Wealth did not erase fear. It often disguised it. As she waited at the bus shelter, an older man seated beside her folded his newspaper carefully and glanced briefly at her wrist. Rough evening? He asked gently. Nothing I can't handle, Nina replied politely. He nodded approvingly. Resilience is a skill most people only develop after they need it. Nina appreciated the observation but did not elaborate. The bus arrived quietly, doors opening with a soft mechanical sigh. She chose a seat near the middle, placing her bag on her lap and watching the city lights slide past the window. Neon reflections blurred into lines of color that seemed almost abstract, like numbers flowing across a financial chart. Her thoughts drifted back to Adrian Volkov. He had intervened without spectacle. No raised voice. No exaggerated gestures. Simply presence. People accustomed to authority rarely needed volume to establish it. She wondered briefly what had prompted his attention. Perhaps simple courtesy. Perhaps something else. At home in Queens, her aunt had already gone to bed, leaving a small kitchen light on as she always did. Nina placed her shoes neatly beside the door and reheated leftover soup on the stove. The familiar routine grounded her. Stability often existed in ordinary details. Warm food, quiet rooms, predictable rhythms. She opened her laptop briefly to review course materials for her financial compliance certification, regulatory frameworks, ethical reporting standards, risk transparency principles. The language of finance, when used responsibly, functioned as a system of accountability. When manipulated, it became something else entirely. Her eyes lingered on a case study describing corporate acquisition structures designed to pressure smaller companies into unfavorable agreements. Predatory leverage disguised as partnership. The pattern reminded her of something she had noticed weeks earlier while organizing files at the Volkov Estate Library. Several financial journals had referenced Hale Capital Partners' recent acquisition strategies: aggressive expansions, rapid consolidation, high-pressure timelines. She had not paid close attention at the time. Now the connection felt less coincidental. Nina closed the laptop gently. Speculation solved nothing without evidence. Yet intuition, once awakened, rarely returned to sleep easily. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through thin curtains. Nina prepared coffee quietly, careful not to wake her aunt too early. She reviewed her work schedule while eating oatmeal at the small kitchen table. Estate shift at noon. Evening reserved for coursework. Her life rarely allowed idle hours. At the Volkov estate, the atmosphere remained calm as always. Order existed here like architecture, intentional, deliberate, controlled. Mrs. Donnelly greeted her with a nod. Routine schedule today? Yes, ma'am. Nina proceeded through familiar hallways, maintaining steady pace. She replaced fresh towels, polished glass surfaces, ensured each room reflected quiet precision. Inside the library, a new stack of financial documents rested on the desk. Not unusual. Yet something about their placement suggested recent review. She aligned them carefully, noticing the Hale Capital Partners logo on one of the visible pages. The article discussed restructuring negotiations involving regional logistics firms. The tone praised strategic foresight. Praise often obscured consequences. Footsteps approached behind her. Nina stepped aside respectfully as Adrian Volkov entered the room. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon, sir." His gaze moved briefly toward the financial journals, then toward the carefully ordered desk. "You maintain consistency," he observed. "I aim to meet expectations," Nina replied. Volkov nodded slightly, as if acknowledging more than the statement itself. After a moment he said, "Your wrist." Nina glanced briefly at the faint discoloration. "It's fine." He considered the answer without pressing further. "Some individuals mistake position for character," he said calmly. Nina remained silent. Professional boundaries mattered. "Competence," he added, "often reveals itself under pressure." "I try to remain useful," Nina replied. Volkov studied her expression briefly. "Usefulness is frequently underestimated," he said. The conversation ended there. No dramatic declarations, no unnecessary commentary, yet the exchange carried weight beyond casual observation. As Volkov left the library, Nina resumed her work with steady hands, but something had changed. Not externally, internally. Awareness often arrived quietly. The previous evening had exposed more than cruelty. It had revealed intersection points between power, perception, and opportunity. Nina did not assume opportunity would appear. She prepared in case it did, because readiness, her mother had often said, was the only advantage fully within one's control. Outside the tall windows, autumn leaves continued falling slowly across the estate grounds. Seasons changed gradually, so did lives. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished wooden floor of the Volkov estate library, casting long rectangular patterns that slowly shifted as the hours passed. Nina Brooks finished aligning the final stack of periodicals, ensuring each corner met perfectly, each page edge parallel to the next. Precision gave her comfort. Order reduced uncertainty. In places where influence quietly shaped decisions worth millions, details mattered. The quiet hum of distant activity carried faintly through the hallway. Somewhere deeper in the estate, muted voices discussed delivery schedules and meeting confirmations. The house functioned like an organism, each role contributing silently to its balance. Nina rarely thought about the scale of operations surrounding her. She simply focused on performing her responsibilities thoroughly. As she placed the last polished glass paperweight back onto the desk, she noticed something new. A slim folder rested near the center of the surface, deliberately positioned rather than casually left behind. Its placement differed from the usual scattered arrangement of journals. This was intentional. Nina did not open it. Professional boundaries had protected her many times before. Instead, she adjusted the angle of the folder, so its edge aligned with the desk grain. Her reflection briefly appeared in the dark surface of the polished wood, reminding her of the conversation from the previous day. Competence often revealed itself under pressure. She did not assume the remark carried deeper meaning. Still, she noticed patterns. Footsteps approached again, measured, unhurried. Adrian Volkov entered the room without announcing himself, though the quiet authority of his presence rarely required introduction. He paused near the doorway, observing the order of the shelves before allowing his gaze to move toward Nina. "You maintain consistency," he said. "Yes, sir," Nina replied respectfully. Volkov stepped closer to the desk, resting one hand lightly against the edge of the surface. His movements were economical, controlled, as though each action served purpose beyond appearance. "Consistency," he repeated thoughtfully, "is a rare trait in environments built on fluctuation." Nina waited, uncertain whether a response was expected. Volkov gestured subtly toward the folder. "You noticed this was placed intentionally. It was not a question." "Yes, sir," Nina answered carefully, "and yet you did not open it." "It was not addressed to me." Volkov studied her expression for a moment, assessing restraint rather than obedience. "Curiosity," he said calmly, "is often mistaken for entitlement." Nina remained composed. "My responsibility is maintaining order, not creating disruption." A faint trace of approval passed through his gaze. "Practical thinking," he observed. He opened the folder himself, revealing several printed pages filled with numerical tables, investment flows, and corporate ownership structures. The documents were dense but not chaotic. Structured complexity. Volkov turned one page slowly. "Tell me," he said without looking up, "if a company expands rapidly into multiple logistical sectors while simultaneously restructuring debt through layered subsidiaries, what risk appears most often underestimated?" The question arrived without warning. Nina paused, not because she lacked an answer, but because she considered whether answering exceeded her role. Volkov looked up. "I am asking your opinion." Nina inhaled carefully. "Overextension," she replied. "Liquidity pressure masked by artificial valuation increases." Volkov remained still. She continued cautiously. "If expansion relies on projected asset performance rather than secured revenue streams, instability compounds faster than most analysts predict." Silence settled between them. Volkov closed the folder halfway. "Most analysts would discuss profit margins first," he said. "Profit is often temporary," Nina answered quietly. "Structural stability determines survival." Volkov studied her more directly now. "And what creates structural stability?" "Transparency," she replied, "and accurate risk acknowledgement." The faintest hint of satisfaction passed across his expression. "You studied finance?" "Yes, sir." "Formally?" "Partially," Nina said. "I completed 2 years before leaving school." "Why did you leave?" "Family obligations." Volkov nodded once, as if the answer confirmed something already suspected. He turned the folder toward her slightly. "These documents represent a current expansion strategy implemented by Hale Capital Partners." Nina recognized the name immediately. Richard Hale. The memory of his voice lingered unpleasantly in her thoughts. Volkov continued. "Several firms connected to regional transportation infrastructure are under negotiation." Nina read the first page carefully, her eyes scanning columns of projected revenue streams and subsidiary structures. Patterns emerged quickly. Debt layering, artificial valuation, inflation, risk displacement through third-party holding entities. She spoke carefully. "These projections assume uninterrupted acquisition approval timelines." "Yes, that assumption creates vulnerability," Nina continued. "If regulatory review delays even one subsidiary transition, the entire financing structure destabilizes." Volkov observed her reaction without interruption. "Which invites strategic leverage from competitors," she added. "Or regulators," Volkov said calmly. Nina inclined her head. "Yes, sir." He closed the folder. "Your analysis aligns with concerns raised internally." Nina stepped back slightly. "I apologize if I overstepped." "You did not," Volkov said evenly. He walked slowly toward the window overlooking the estate grounds. Autumn leaves scattered across trimmed grass in careful imperfection. "Last evening," he said, "Mr. Hale demonstrated confidence." "Yes, sir. Confidence," Volkov continued, "is most dangerous when supported by flawed assumptions." Nina remained silent. "Tell me," he added, turning slightly toward her, "what motivates individuals who pursue expansion beyond sustainable thresholds?" Nina considered carefully. "Fear of stagnation," she said. "And?" "Desire for dominance." Volkov nodded. "And what often blinds them?" "Belief they cannot be challenged." The room remained quiet except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Volkov returned the folder to the desk. "You demonstrated composure yesterday," he said. "Many individuals respond emotionally to humiliation." Nina met his gaze briefly. "Emotion complicates resolution." "Yes," Volkov replied. "It often does." He adjusted the position of the folder slightly, then added, "Competence attracts attention, sometimes desirable, sometimes dangerous." "I understand," Nina said. "Do you?" His tone was not confrontational, merely curious. "I understand that visibility creates consequence," she answered. Volkov studied her response carefully. "Very well." He paused before continuing. "I require temporary analytical assistance reviewing acquisition risk exposure related to Hale Capital's recent activities." Nina did not react immediately. He clarified. "Independent review. Confidential. Professional compensation." Nina hesitated. Her position in the household remained clearly defined. Yet the opportunity represented something she had worked toward quietly for years. "I am currently employed in housekeeping," she said carefully. "Yes, I would not want to create conflict regarding responsibilities." This assignment would occur outside standard service hours, Volkov replied. She considered the implications. Working 2 jobs had already required discipline. Adding analytical responsibility would require careful balance. Yet intellectual work aligned with her long-term goals. What would be the expected scope? She asked. Volkov handed her a business card. A simple design. Minimal information. Discreet. Initial document review, he said, followed by discussion. Nina accepted the card respectfully. I would need to ensure the work remains lawful. Volkov's expression remained neutral. Lawful stability benefits all parties. She nodded slowly. Then I would be willing to assist. Volkov inclined his head once. Discretion remains essential. Of course. As he turned to leave, he added quietly, some individuals measure value based on titles. He paused briefly. Others recognize it before titles appear. After he exited the library, Nina remained still for several seconds. Opportunity rarely arrived, announced. It appeared quietly, unexpectedly, demanding preparation rather than celebration. She looked down at the business card resting in her hand. Her reflection in the polished desk surface appeared calm, focused, ready. Outside, autumn continued its steady transformation across the estate grounds. Change rarely occurred suddenly. It revealed itself through accumulation of moments, one conversation at a time. The first evening Nina Brooks reviewed the documents. She sat at the small wooden table in her aunt's kitchen long after the city had gone quiet. The overhead light hummed faintly, illuminating stacks of printed pages beside her laptop. Outside the apartment window, distant traffic murmured along Queens Boulevard, a constant reminder that life moved forward regardless of personal crossroads. She had changed into a simple sweater and tied her hair loosely back, removing the uniform that defined her days. Yet the discipline of her posture remained. Nina approached complex information the way she approached every responsibility. Carefully, patiently, without assumption. The folder Adrian Volkov had provided contained acquisition maps, debt layering structures, and multi-tier subsidiary relationships tied to Hale Capital Partners. At first glance, the strategy appeared efficient, aggressive, but structured. Yet as Nina progressed through the pages, inconsistencies began revealing themselves in subtle ways. Projected growth curves depended on unusually optimistic regulatory approval timelines. Several shell subsidiaries shared overlapping board members, a pattern often used to create the illusion of independent oversight. Liquidity buffers appeared inflated through projected asset transfers rather than secured capital. It was not illegal on its surface, but it was fragile. She opened a spreadsheet template on her laptop, reconstructing the structure in simplified form. Her training had taught her that complexity often concealed vulnerability. Strip away excess layers, and structural weaknesses became easier to identify. By midnight, Nina had identified 3 pressure points that could destabilize Hale Capital's expansion if challenged through regulatory delay or credit reassessment. She leaned back slightly, allowing her eyes a moment of rest. Her aunt's framed photograph rested on the counter nearby, showing her younger self beside her mother years earlier. Both smiling. Both hopeful in ways adulthood often complicated. You don't need permission to be capable, her mother had once told her during a late-night study session years ago. Capability did not guarantee opportunity, but preparation ensured readiness. The following afternoon, Nina returned to the Volkov estate for her regular shift. The familiarity of routine tasks grounded her thoughts as she dusted surfaces and aligned decorative objects with practiced precision. Mrs. Donnelly noticed her focused expression. "Long night?" she asked kindly. "Productive," Nina replied. "That's usually better," Mrs. Donnelly said. Nina completed her scheduled responsibilities before the agreed hour for document review. She had been instructed to meet in a smaller office adjoining the main library, a workspace typically reserved for private consultations rather than household operations. The room was modest compared to the grander spaces of the estate. A dark walnut desk, 2 leather chairs, a wall lined with neatly arranged binders, no decorative excess, functional efficiency. Adrian Volkov entered precisely on time. Punctuality, Nina had observed, often signaled respect. "You reviewed the documents," he said. "Yes. And?" Nina placed her annotated summary on the desk between them. The expansion model relies on synchronized approval across multiple regulatory jurisdictions, she explained. Any delay introduces liquidity strain across dependent subsidiaries. Volkov remained silent, allowing her to continue. The structure attempts to offset exposure through projected valuation increases tied to anticipated market confidence, Nina added. However, those valuations assume uninterrupted growth patterns. Volkov nodded once. Which rarely occur. Yes, Nina agreed. She indicated a highlighted section. 3 shell entities rely on shared guarantor commitments. If one entity experiences disruption, cross-liability pressure increases disproportionately. Volkov reviewed her notes carefully. You constructed this independently? Yes. No external references? No. Volkov closed the folder. Your conclusions align with internal risk projections. Nina inclined her head slightly. The structure prioritizes speed over resilience. Volkov considered the phrasing. Speed attracts investors, he said. Resilience protects outcomes, Nina replied. A brief pause settled between them. Volkov leaned back slightly. Richard Hale's strategy depends on competitors reacting emotionally rather than analytically, he said. Nina considered this. Emotion creates timing errors. Yes. Volkov studied her expression. You did not respond emotionally last night. Nina answered carefully. Public reaction rarely improves private outcomes. Volkov nodded faintly, as if confirming a hypothesis. Mr. Hale believes perception influences leverage, he continued. He relies heavily on psychological positioning. Nina remembered the humiliation clearly. Yes. What did you observe? Nina chose her words carefully. He escalates conflict when challenged indirectly. And he seeks visible dominance to reinforce perceived authority. Volkov folded his hands calmly. Such behavior creates predictable patterns. Yes, and predictable patterns, Volkov said quietly, create opportunity. Nina understood the implication. Opportunity did not always present itself as advantage. Sometimes it appeared as responsibility. Volkov slid another document across the desk. Several logistics firms currently negotiating with Hale Capital may reconsider partnership if structural instability becomes evident. Nina reviewed the summary briefly. Their exposure risk appears significant, she said. Yes. Would they respond to revised projections? Possibly. Nina considered the broader impact. If their boards recognize instability, withdrawal decisions could cascade. Exactly. The conversation remained entirely professional. No raised voices, no dramatics, only analysis. Volkov stood and walked toward the window, observing the estate grounds beyond the glass. Power, he said calmly, often depends on information asymmetry. Yes, and information, he continued, becomes valuable only when interpreted correctly. Nina closed her notebook. Interpretation requires patience. And discipline. He turned slightly. You demonstrate both. Nina did not respond verbally. Professional acknowledgement did not require elaboration. Volkov returned to the desk. Your role remains advisory, he said. No direct engagement with external entities. I understand. Confidentiality remains essential. Of course. He paused before adding, your existing responsibilities within the estate remain unchanged. I will maintain both. Volkov studied her briefly. Balance requires precision. I am accustomed to precision. The faintest hint of approval crossed his expression. Very well. As Nina gathered her materials, she felt neither triumph nor anxiety. Only clarity. Opportunity did not guarantee success. It created obligation. Outside the office, the household routine continued uninterrupted. Staff members moved efficiently through corridors, maintaining the invisible framework supporting visible influence. Nina resumed her housekeeping responsibilities without drawing attention to the conversation that had just occurred. Quiet progress often attracted less resistance. Later that evening, she reviewed additional financial patterns at her kitchen table, reconstructing acquisition timelines and identifying stress points within Hale Capital's expansion model. Her notes became increasingly structured. Patterns became clearer. Richard Hale's strategy relied heavily on aggressive leverage supported by projected confidence rather than secured stability. Confidence could fluctuate. Structure endured longer. Near midnight, Nina closed her laptop and placed her mother's calculator beside the new printed analysis. Past discipline supporting present opportunity. She understood the risks involved. Complex financial environments rarely offered simple outcomes. But she also understood something equally important. Respect, once recognized, carried responsibility. And responsibility, once accepted, required courage. The following weeks would test whether quiet competence could withstand visible power. Nina Brooks prepared carefully, because preparation, unlike recognition, remained entirely within her control. Over the next 10 days, Nina Brooks learned how quietly power could rearrange itself when guided by discipline instead of ego. Her schedule did not change outwardly. Each morning she still arrived at the Volkov estate through the staff entrance, signed her name neatly on the clipboard, and greeted Mrs. Donnelly with the same respectful composure she had always shown. Routine remained her anchor. It prevented ambition from becoming recklessness. Yet internally, everything had shifted. Her evenings were now divided between coursework and analytical review. Financial models replaced television. Regulatory frameworks replaced casual distraction. The complexity of Hale Capital's acquisition web became clearer each night, as Nina reconstructed its structure line by line, isolating assumptions that could not withstand scrutiny. She began to notice a recurring pattern. Hale's strategy depended heavily on speed, intimidating competitors into passive acceptance. The faster the expansion moved, the less time regulators, partners, or smaller firms had to fully evaluate exposure risks. Speed created pressure. Pressure created mistakes. Mistakes created leverage. Nina documented everything carefully, building simplified charts that clarified where Hale's financial structure depended on uninterrupted confidence from investors who might withdraw support if instability appeared even briefly. On the 11th evening, Volkov requested a private review in the smaller office again. The hour was later than usual. The estate remained quiet except for distant kitchen staff finishing cleanup after a private dinner meeting. Volkov entered precisely at 8 o'clock, removing his jacket and placing it neatly over the back of the chair. His posture carried the calm control of someone accustomed to high-stakes decisions occurring behind closed doors. "You have identified additional vulnerabilities," he said. "Yes," Nina replied, sliding a structured report across the desk. Volkov reviewed the summary silently. "The liquidity dependency between Hale's transport subsidiaries and real estate collateral is overstated," Nina explained. "Several projected asset transfers rely on optimistic market responses rather than secured contractual guarantees." Volkov's eyes moved steadily across the page. "And if market response weakens, the debt structure becomes fragile." "How fragile?" Nina pointed to a highlighted section. "If two mid-tier partners delay participation, projected capital reinforcement fails." Volkov nodded once. "Cascade effect." "Yes." He leaned back slightly, considering. "Hale relies on intimidation to accelerate agreement timelines." "Yes. Intimidation," Volkov said quietly, "often produces artificial consensus." Nina understood the distinction. Artificial consensus rarely lasted. Volkov closed the folder slowly. "You recognize the personal element involved." "Yes." "Hale attempts to establish dominance early." "Yes." "Your composure disrupted his expected sequence." Nina hesitated briefly. "I did not intend to disrupt anything." "Intent," Volkov replied calmly, "rarely determines outcome." Silence settled briefly between them. Volkov studied her expression with careful neutrality. "Competence," he continued, "creates unpredictable variables." Nina understood the implication. Visibility increased risk, but invisibility limited influence. Balance required judgment. Volkov placed a second document on the desk. "This represents Hale's next acquisition target." Nina reviewed the page. "A mid-sized logistics firm specializing in interstate freight routing. Privately owned for 3 generations. Projected acquisition timeline: 6 weeks. Aggressive. Family-owned," Nina noted. "Yes." "Likely emotionally invested." "Yes." "Hale will apply pressure." "Yes." Nina considered the implications. If structural instability becomes visible before contract signing, board members may reconsider. Volkov nodded. "Precisely." She hesitated. Would revealing instability violate ethical boundaries? Volkov did not respond immediately. Truth, he said finally, rarely violates ethics. Nina considered the phrasing carefully. Truth could be used responsibly or destructively. Her responsibility remained clear. Maintain integrity, provide analysis, avoid manipulation. I will ensure conclusions remain supported by verifiable data, she said. That is expected. Volkov stood and walked toward the window overlooking the darkened gardens. Mr. Hale believes perception determines leverage, he said quietly. Perception can shift, Nina replied. Yes, and when perception shifts, Volkov added, so does influence. Nina gathered her notes methodically. Her involvement remained analytical, not strategic execution. Still, she recognized the widening scope of consequence. Complex financial systems rarely affected only those directly involved. Employees, communities, families. Decisions at executive levels rippled outward. Her mother had once described finance as architecture invisible to most people. When constructed responsibly, it created stability. When manipulated carelessly, collapse followed. You appear thoughtful, Volkov observed. I consider long-term impact. That perspective is increasingly rare. Nina did not respond. Praise was not her objective. Precision was. Volkov returned to the desk. Your discretion remains essential. Of course, visibility will increase. I understand. Some individuals respond aggressively to perceived challenge. Nina met his gaze calmly. Reaction reveals insecurity. Volkov studied her response with quiet interest. You adapt quickly. I prepare carefully. He inclined his head slightly. Continue preparation. As the meeting concluded, Nina returned to her usual responsibilities within the estate. She replaced fresh towels in guest rooms, polished brass fixtures, ensured every surface reflected quiet order. Externally, nothing had changed. Internally, her responsibilities had expanded significantly. Late that evening, while reviewing regulatory filings related to Hale Capital's expansion targets, Nina noticed an additional irregularity, a consulting firm repeatedly appearing across multiple acquisition negotiations. Nominally independent, structurally aligned, influence disguised as neutrality. She documented the connection carefully. Patterns rarely appeared in isolation. Each discovery reinforced her initial conclusion. Hale's strategy relied on momentum overpowering scrutiny. Momentum could be interrupted. Carefully. Legally. Precisely. By midnight, her notes extended across several structured outlines identifying potential regulatory review triggers that would require extended verification periods. Time created hesitation. Hesitation created reconsideration. Reconsideration created negotiation leverage. Nina closed her laptop slowly, aware that her role continued evolving beyond its original scope. Responsibility did not always arrive accompanied by permission. Sometimes it emerged gradually through recognition of ability. The following morning, as she entered the estate library once again, the quiet familiarity of polished wood and filtered sunlight reminded her that external appearances rarely reflected internal complexity. She continued her work with the same discipline she had always applied. Fold linens evenly. Align objects precisely. Observe patterns carefully. Because influence, she had begun to understand, did not always belong to those who spoke the loudest. Sometimes it belonged to those who understood the structure beneath the surface. And structures, once understood, could be reinforced or challenged, depending on who possessed the clarity to see them fully. By the third week, Nina Brooks had mapped enough of Hale Capital's expansion framework to recognize a deeper strategy beneath the surface transactions. Richard Hale was not merely acquiring companies, he was building dependency chains designed to corner competitors into cooperation before they fully understood the risks involved. The brilliance of the system lay in its appearance of legitimacy. Every document followed legal structure. Every agreement passed compliance review. Yet the cumulative pressure of timing, leverage, and perceived inevitability created conditions where resistance became increasingly difficult. Nina reviewed the most recent acquisition timeline late one evening, her small kitchen illuminated by the glow of her laptop screen. A logistics firm based in Pennsylvania had been added to the list of pending negotiations. Like the previous targets, it was a privately held family company with moderate debt exposure but strong operational stability. Businesses like these often valued legacy over rapid expansion, making them vulnerable to pressure disguised as opportunity. Her spreadsheet revealed a familiar pattern. Hale's team introduced generous valuation projections tied to accelerated growth forecasts, encouraging board members to accept aggressive restructuring terms before independent analysts could fully evaluate sustainability. Confidence offered quickly, pressure applied quietly, commitment secured early. Nina leaned back slightly, allowing her eyes to rest. Her notes now extended across multiple structured summaries linking Hale's consulting intermediaries, legal advisors, and capital channels. Individually, each element appeared routine. Collectively, they revealed orchestration. She saved her analysis under encrypted formatting, maintaining careful organization. Discipline in documentation protected clarity under pressure. The following afternoon, she arrived at the Volkov estate under steady gray skies. Autumn had deepened, leaves gathering along the edges of the driveway like muted signals of transition. Inside, the household routine continued with its usual precision. Mrs. Donnelly greeted her with quiet approval. "You've been working long hours," she observed. "Temporary adjustment," Nina replied. Mrs. Donnelly nodded thoughtfully. "Opportunities often require inconvenient timing." Nina appreciated the observation. Inside the smaller office adjoining the library, Adrian Volkov was already reviewing documents when she entered. His presence remained composed, his attention focused entirely on the material before him. "You have identified additional connections," he said without preamble. "Yes." She placed a structured summary on the desk. "Hale's intermediary consulting firm appears repeatedly across unrelated acquisitions," she explained. "Nominal independence, but consistent financial routing." Volkov reviewed the highlighted sections carefully. "Centralized influence disguised as distributed evaluation," he said. "Yes." "And motive?" "Control of negotiation tempo," Nina replied. Volkov nodded slowly. "Tempo often determines outcome." She hesitated briefly. "The Pennsylvania firm appears hesitant." "Understandable. Their board demonstrates traditional governance structure, which slows decision velocity," Volkov observed. "Yes, slower decisions create exposure windows," he added. Nina considered the phrasing. "Exposure windows allow time for accurate risk evaluation." Volkov closed the folder. "And accurate evaluation often produces resistance." Silence settled between them. Nina spoke carefully. "If their advisors recognize structural fragility within Hale's financing model, they may reconsider participation." Volkov regarded her steadily. "What would prompt such recognition?" "Independent review." "And who would initiate that review?" Nina met his gaze briefly. "Concerned stakeholders." Volkov inclined his head faintly. "Concern must appear credible." "Yes. Credibility requires evidence." "I have structured preliminary findings," she said. Volkov studied her expression with measured neutrality. "You remain aware of professional boundaries." "Yes." "Your analysis identifies structural risk," he continued. "Yes. And presenting structural risk constitutes legitimate financial disclosure." "Yes." He paused. "Then proceed carefully." Nina understood the instruction clearly. Precision, documentation, restraint. Later that evening, Nina refined her report to ensure each conclusion relied exclusively on verifiable public financial filings and transparent structural modeling. Her objective was not to manipulate perception, but to clarify reality. Reality, once visible, often influenced decisions naturally. Her mother had once explained that numbers did not create truth, they revealed it. 3 days later, a small development confirmed her analysis was producing impact. The Pennsylvania firm delayed signing its preliminary agreement with Hale Capital pending additional review of financing stability assurances. Delay introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty introduced caution. Caution slowed momentum. Momentum disruption affected perception. Perception influenced investor confidence. The chain reaction remained subtle, but measurable. Volkov acknowledged the development during their next scheduled review. "Hale's timeline has shifted," he said. Yes. He did not anticipate hesitation. No. Hesitation alters negotiation dynamics. Yes. Volkov observed her carefully. You understand that individuals accustomed to dominance often respond strongly when challenged. Yes. And Mr. Hale has demonstrated preference for visible control. Nina remembered the ballroom clearly. Yes. Expect escalation, Volkov said calmly. She nodded. Preparedness required anticipating reaction. Later that week, Nina noticed something unusual within newly filed regulatory correspondence linked to Hale Capital's pending acquisitions. A legal advisory group had submitted an inquiry requesting clarification regarding projected liquidity reinforcement schedules. The language was precise, professional, neutral. Yet the existence of the inquiry confirmed independent analysts had begun questioning assumptions embedded within Hale's expansion framework. Momentum had slowed further. Nina documented the update and forwarded the summary through the secure channel Volkov had provided. His response arrived shortly afterward. Continue observation. Maintain neutrality. No unnecessary exposure. The instruction reinforced her existing approach. Visibility required control. That evening, as she walked home from the bus stop beneath dim streetlights, Nina considered the delicate balance she now navigated. Her role remained analytical, yet her work had begun influencing outcomes affecting companies employing hundreds of individuals. Responsibility expanded quietly, without ceremony, without announcement. The following afternoon, while reviewing updated acquisition projections within the estate office, she identified a sudden shift in Hale Capital's financial posture. Additional liquidity had been redirected toward reinforcing investor confidence. Emergency stabilization. Defensive adjustment. Richard Hale had recognized resistance. Resistance often provoked reaction. Nina made careful notation of the adjustment pattern. Adaptive strategy often revealed underlying pressure. Later that evening, Volkov addressed the development calmly. Hale is accelerating alternative financing channels. Yes. He intends to maintain perception of inevitability. Yes. Perception management becomes increasingly expensive under scrutiny. Yes. Volkov regarded her thoughtfully. You remain comfortable continuing? Nina answered without hesitation. I remain committed to accuracy. He inclined his head once. Accuracy remains the most stable position. As the meeting concluded, Nina gathered her materials with steady focus. She understood the coming phase would test not only analytical discipline, but emotional resilience. Individuals who relied heavily on dominance rarely retreated quietly. Yet she also understood something increasingly clear. Respect, built slowly, but once established internally, it could not be easily removed externally. Preparation remained her advantage. And preparation, unlike recognition, required no permission. The change did not announce itself loudly. It appeared first as hesitation in correspondence, then as subtle adjustments in financial positioning that only someone trained to recognize structural tension would notice. Nina Brooks observed the shift late on a Thursday evening while reviewing updated filings connected to Hale Capital's newest acquisition attempt. The Pennsylvania logistics firm had not withdrawn entirely, but their legal team had introduced additional conditional language, requiring extended verification periods tied to capital guarantees. Verification created delay. Delay created visibility. Visibility created scrutiny. And scrutiny altered power. Nina enlarged the spreadsheet on her laptop screen. Isolating capital flow projections now adjusted to compensate for extended approval timelines. Hale's team had injected supplemental liquidity through secondary holding entities to maintain confidence across partner firms. The move was effective in appearance, but costly in sustainability. She leaned slightly closer to the screen, examining cross-liability exposure. The reinforcement strategy depended on maintaining uninterrupted perception of financial dominance. But perception, once questioned, required increasing expenditure to sustain. Confidence had become an operating expense. That realization mattered. The following afternoon at the Volkov estate, the sky remained overcast, the kind of gray that softened shadows and made distances appear closer than they were. Nina completed her scheduled responsibilities before entering the small office where analytical discussions continued to unfold with deliberate calm. Volkov reviewed the updated data she had transmitted earlier. Hale has reinforced capital reserves, he observed. Yes, Nina replied. Costly reinforcement. Yes. Temporary stabilization. Yes. Volkov set the document down. He is attempting to preserve negotiation tempo. Yes. Nina opened a summary page. The Pennsylvania firm has requested extended review of subsidiary liquidity commitments. Volkov nodded faintly. Reasonable. Yes. Their hesitation influences adjacent negotiations. Yes. Momentum continues slowing. Yes. Volkov studied her carefully. Slowing momentum creates psychological pressure. Yes. Pressure produces reaction. Yes. He leaned back slightly. Mr. Hale has built his influence on the assumption that resistance would remain fragmented. Nina understood the implication. Fragmented resistance rarely altered large-scale outcomes. Coordinated caution could. Later that evening, Nina reviewed communications filed publicly through regulatory channels. Independent advisors representing 2 additional firms connected to Hale's acquisition network had submitted inquiries requesting clarification regarding projected asset liquidity schedules. The language remained professional, neutral, measured, but the pattern was unmistakable. Questions were multiplying. Hale's strategy relied on uninterrupted confidence. Confidence now required reassurance. Reassurance required explanation. Explanation created exposure. The chain reaction remained quiet but measurable. 3 days later, the situation escalated subtly but significantly. Nina received notification through Volkov's secure communication channel, indicating that Hale Capital had requested a private negotiation meeting with the Pennsylvania firm's board ahead of the scheduled contract timeline. Acceleration suggested concern. Concern indicated vulnerability. Nina reviewed the scheduled location. A private executive parking facility beneath a corporate conference building in Lower Manhattan. Controlled environment. Limited visibility. Direct influence attempt. She compiled a structured summary of projected discussion points based on Hale's known negotiation patterns. Volkov reviewed the report later that evening. He will attempt to restore dominance through presence, Volkov said. Yes. Direct pressure often follows structural hesitation. Yes. Expected participants? Primary board members and legal advisors. Volkov considered the timeline. Hale prefers closed environments for leverage application. Yes. Controlled perception environment. Yes. Nina hesitated briefly. Closed environments reduce external accountability. Volkov regarded her steadily. Which creates risk. Yes. He nodded once. Preparation remains essential. Nina continued refining the risk exposure summary, ensuring all conclusions relied exclusively on publicly verifiable financial structure vulnerabilities. Her objective remained consistent: clarity without manipulation. Clarity often created its own influence. 2 evenings later, Nina reviewed a final update transmitted through regulatory correspondence networks. Hale Capital had modified its liquidity guarantee language within pending agreements, introducing conditional reassessment clauses previously absent from earlier drafts. Subtle wording change. Significant implication. Hale's legal team had begun adjusting defensive positioning. Defensive positioning confirmed pressure. Pressure confirmed impact. That evening, Volkov addressed the development calmly. Hale is recalibrating contractual language. Yes. He recognizes increased scrutiny. Yes. Scrutiny increases cost of dominance. Yes. Volkov folded the document carefully. Individuals accustomed to unquestioned authority often respond poorly when required to justify assumptions. Yes. Expectation management becomes more difficult. Yes. Nina closed her notebook gently. His strategy depends on maintaining perception of inevitability. Yes. Perception is weakening. Yes. Volkov observed her quietly. You anticipated this sequence. I identified structural pressure points. Yes. Pressure alters behavior. Yes. Volkov leaned slightly forward. The next phase will test emotional discipline. Nina understood immediately. When influence begins shifting, individuals invested heavily in control often escalate unpredictably. Emotional reaction could create strategic error. The following afternoon, Nina continued her regular responsibilities throughout the estate, maintaining consistency in outward behavior. She polished brass fixtures, replaced fresh linens, ensured each space reflected quiet order. Consistency protected invisibility. Invisibility protected flexibility. Later that evening, she reviewed one final update transmitted through regulatory filings. Hale Capital had requested expedited private consultation with several partner firms simultaneously. Coordinated reassurance attempt, perception stabilization effort. Acceleration indicated concern regarding widening hesitation among acquisition targets. Nina documented the shift carefully. Each adjustment confirmed the structural pressure she had identified earlier. She transmitted her analysis securely. Volkov's response arrived shortly afterward. Proceed cautiously. Maintain professional distance. Do not engage directly. Clarity remains advantage. Nina closed her laptop and sat quietly for several moments, allowing her thoughts to settle. She understood the coming interaction between Hale and his partners would determine whether perception stabilized or fractured further. Dominance relied on confidence. Confidence relied on consistency. Consistency had begun eroding. She did not celebrate the realization. She simply acknowledged it. Because influence rarely shifted dramatically in a single moment. It moved gradually, quietly, often unnoticed until balance had already changed, and those prepared to recognize change early rarely needed to force outcomes aggressively. Preparation allowed outcomes to unfold naturally. Nina Brooks understood her role remained analytical, yet analysis, when applied precisely, often shaped events more effectively than confrontation. The coming meeting would test whether structure outweighed intimidation, and whether quiet discipline could withstand visible authority. She prepared accordingly, because preparation remained the one advantage no one could remove once it had been earned. The meeting did not appear in headlines, nor did it generate immediate public reaction. Influence rarely announced itself through spectacle, when experienced individuals recognized risk beneath the surface. The private consultation arranged by Hale Capital proceeded behind closed doors in the Lower Manhattan executive facility, where polished concrete floors and controlled lighting reflected an atmosphere designed to project authority. Nina Brooks did not attend the meeting, nor did she require physical presence to understand its significance. The documentation patterns, revised contractual language, and accelerated reassurance attempts had already revealed the underlying tension. Hale needed to restore confidence. Confidence required cooperation. Cooperation could no longer be assumed. That afternoon, while sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows of the Volkov Estate Library, Nina completed her scheduled housekeeping duties with the same deliberate precision she had maintained from the beginning. Routine remained her anchor. Discipline remained her protection. Inside the smaller office, Adrian Volkov reviewed a summary transmitted earlier through secure correspondence channels. Independent advisors representing the Pennsylvania firm had formally requested extended evaluation periods before committing to Hale's acquisition structure. Additional firms connected through secondary negotiations had followed the same cautious approach. Hesitation had become measurable. Volkov closed the document calmly. "Momentum has shifted," he said. "Yes," Nina replied. Hale anticipated rapid compliance. "Yes, confidence is no longer automatic." "Yes." Volkov rested his hand lightly on the desk. "Perception evolves when structural weaknesses become visible." "Yes." Silence settled briefly between them. Nina did not interpret the development as victory, only confirmation. Careful preparation had revealed underlying instability without requiring confrontation. Volkov regarded her thoughtfully. "You maintained analytical discipline throughout." "I maintained accuracy. Accuracy created clarity." "Yes." Volkov inclined his head slightly. Clarity altered outcome. Nina accepted the observation quietly. Influence did not belong exclusively to those holding visible authority. Sometimes influence emerged through understanding the architecture beneath decisions. Over the following week, Hale Capital adjusted its expansion strategy publicly, emphasizing selective partnership refinement rather than aggressive consolidation. Financial media framed the change as strategic patience, though the underlying recalibration remained apparent to experienced analysts. Pressure had produced adaptation. Adaptation confirmed vulnerability. Nina continued reviewing documentation carefully, ensuring her analysis remained grounded in verifiable structure, rather than interpretation shaped by emotion. Her objective had never been personal retaliation, only structural clarity. One evening, as autumn wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the Volkov estate, Volkov addressed the outcome with characteristic restraint. "Hale has reduced acquisition velocity," he said. "Yes. Stability often requires recalibration." "Yes." Volkov observed her steadily. "You approached the situation without seeking recognition. Recognition was not relevant. Many individuals would have responded differently. Emotional reaction rarely improves structural outcome." Volkov considered her response carefully. "Emotional reaction often satisfies immediate impulse." "Yes, but rarely secures long-term stability." "Yes." He walked slowly toward the window overlooking the estate grounds. "Mr. Hale values visible authority." "Yes." Visible authority sometimes mistakes volume for strength. Nina remained silent. Volkov turned slightly. "Quiet strength often proves more durable." Nina accepted the observation without comment. Her role remained defined by discipline rather than recognition. 2 weeks later, Hale Capital publicly announced revised partnership structures, emphasizing cooperative investment timelines rather than accelerated consolidation. The Pennsylvania firm retained independent governance while negotiating limited strategic collaboration under more balanced terms. The adjustment reflected equilibrium, not defeat, not dominance. Balance. Volkov reviewed the announcement without visible reaction. "Markets respond favorably to stability," he said. "Yes." "Instability increases cost." "Yes." "Cost alters behavior." "Yes." The conversation ended there. No celebration, no declaration of victory, only acknowledgement that structural clarity had produced measurable outcome. That evening, Nina returned home under cool November air, carrying her worn canvas bag containing both her mother's calculator and the encrypted flash drive storing her analytical summaries. She placed both items on the small kitchen table beside her laptop. Past discipline. Present opportunity. Future responsibility. Her aunt entered the kitchen quietly. "You've been working very hard," she said gently. "Temporary adjustment," Nina replied. Her aunt smiled knowingly. "Sometimes temporary adjustments create permanent direction." Nina considered the statement thoughtfully. She understood now that respect, once established internally, did not depend on external validation. Her value had not appeared suddenly. It had always existed. Opportunity had simply revealed it. The following afternoon, Volkov requested one final review meeting within the small office. He placed a single document on the desk. A formal consulting agreement outlining continued analytical advisory services under clearly defined legal parameters. Transparent. Lawful. Professional. Nina reviewed the document carefully. "I will continue to maintain my responsibilities within the estate," she said. "Yes," Volkov replied. "Stability requires continuity." "Yes." She signed the agreement calmly. No dramatic moment accompanied the signature, only quiet recognition that her discipline had produced measurable trust. Volkov folded the signed document carefully. "Titles often follow demonstrated capability," he said. Nina inclined her head slightly. "Capability requires continuous responsibility." "Yes." He paused briefly. "Respect," he added, "cannot be demanded." "No. It must be demonstrated consistently." "Yes." Nina gathered her materials and prepared to resume her regular duties. Externally, her life remained balanced between structured routine and expanding intellectual responsibility. Internally, her understanding of influence had evolved. Power did not always appear in grand gestures. Sometimes it existed in careful preparation, measured decisions, consistent integrity. Several days later, while organizing the library once more, Nina placed her mother's calculator inside the drawer of the desk assigned for her analytical work. Beside it rested her laptop and organized financial summaries prepared through weeks of disciplined effort. Past and present aligned quietly. Through the tall windows, the late afternoon sun reflected softly across the estate grounds, illuminating the final leaves clinging to autumn branches. Seasons changed gradually, so did identity. Nina Brooks was still the same woman who had entered the ballroom weeks earlier carrying a tray of crystal glasses, still disciplined, still composed, still observant, but no longer invisible. Respect had not been given. It had been earned. Quietly. Precisely. irreversibly. And somewhere within the evolving architecture of decisions shaping futures larger than her own, Nina understood a truth her mother had once expressed simply: justice rarely announces itself loudly, but when built carefully, it endures. This story reminds us that dignity does not come from status, wealth, or titles, but from character, discipline, and self-respect. Nina was judged by her uniform and underestimated because of her position, yet her strength came from preparation, integrity, and the quiet confidence she built over years of perseverance. The story teaches that true power is not found in loud dominance or public humiliation, but in calm self-control, ethical choices, and the courage to remain principled when treated unfairly. Respect cannot be forced, and justice does not always arrive dramatically. But when a person continues to act with clarity and honor, the world eventually recognizes their value. The deeper lesson for mature audiences is that life often tests us through unfair moments, yet those moments can become turning points when we choose wisdom over anger and purpose over pride. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,